Well, this is the key guy. Okay.
Sorry, 前面的蹲一下。Okay, please. Here.
That's the biggest part of the job. Once you learn how to smile, everything else.
Yes.
He had a similar.
Please, well, come here, quick.
Like that one.
Oh, the credit union person, wait, come on. And the fellow next to you also come on.
Gilbert. Now me. Gilbert.
Gilbert.
那要不要前面的坐一排好吗？这样子坐了，坐啊。
Can we all get in?
Can we get everyone in?
PC. Come on, PC, quick.
Go ahead.
Democratic reform. That's a tough one.
Democratic.
But that's fine. You can hang on to it because the phone numbers are all still the same.
No, I didn't introduce you.
Oh, okay.
And we have forms as well as Jamie.
And now I'd like to invite Ying Hop to come and introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank everyone here for being present in order to discuss and have a workshop. It's a very informal one with a very outstanding minister in our government, Mr. Vic Toews. Now, Mr. Vic Toews actually is our member from Treasury in Manitoba, and he was first elected at the end of year 2000 in the opposition, and he was the opposition critic for justice at that time. And then he was re-elected twice. And of course the final time was just simply last year, January the 27th, I believe, was the date of the election. And in the event, he has held two very important posts. And this is the reason why he's here today. First of all, he was Minister of Justice and Attorney General for Canada. And we all know Mr. Vic Toews because of his tightening up of criminal laws and his improvement of the whole system in terms of justice in that one short period of 1 year. Those of us who had the good fortune to see him and listen to him in parliamentary debates on the various channels in CPAC will be very, very familiar with how effective Mr. Vic Toews is. Today, he comes in a dual role. He is also the president of the Treasury Board. Now, I don't know which is more important, but as far as I'm concerned, they're both very important. And he has been appointed January the 4th of this year to that role. I think that it's very important for us to be here today to listen to him and to share thoughts with him. We're all conservatives and friends of conservatives, and we know that in the coming year or years, we will be in government for a long, long time. Now, I think I should mention that we also have the good fortune to have Peter Van Loan here today. And Peter, congratulations, Peter. We're old friends from way back, and we've campaigned many, many times together. Peter is the government House leader now, and is also the Minister of Democratic Reform. And those are very important things because as far as our government is concerned, this whole cultivation of democratic reform means that we're going to be involving as much of the voting population as possible, and particularly in the multicultural area. I think it's fortunate that Peter has taken the time to come here in order to share thoughts with us also. So without any further delay, may I invite our minister to come and address us. Mr. Vic Toews. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian, for the very kind words and for the opportunity to be here with you. It's always good to share a room with my colleague here, who many of you have known for a number of years, but also to speak to fellow conservatives. I'm very pleased to be here, and I've had some good opportunities already in Toronto. I've had a number of meetings today. I intend to have more meetings, and certainly our party knows that we need to do better in an area like Toronto and the surrounding communities. And I know that given our past record of this past year, that we are going to do better. And we also want to wish Mr. Yuan all the very best in the provincial by-election. I understand he has to leave already. He's supposed to go knock doors. He has a tough taskmaster, Pauline Browse, and as you know her, she no doubt gave him a few minutes off to come here, shake hands, but he's got to go down and get real work done and leave the talking to us here today. And as I say, it's always a pleasure to be here in the Greater Toronto Area, in particular to Markham. And as I begin to settle down in my new job as the Treasury Board President, I've enjoyed the opportunity to meet with a wide range of people, from public servants and labor representatives to business people like you. It's a big new challenge for me. I know that the Minister of Justice was a very weighty responsibility, and I don't know which one is more important, but it seems that I have more friends in this one. I don't know whether it's to do with controlling the purse strings of the government. It's amazing how many friends $224 billion a year can buy you. But I know that we are not conservatives because of what government can buy for us, but rather the framework that the government can put in place to allow people to actually get the job done for themselves. We want to create opportunities to strengthen our country, to enlarge our wealth, and we want to do that, we know, by welcoming more newcomers to Canada. Most of us come from immigrant backgrounds. My parents were both refugees, and I was born overseas. And so I know that there's always a difficulty in coming to a new area, to a new country. When I came to Canada, I couldn't speak English, but that wasn't something that held us back. In time, we learned to speak English, and as a community, we learned to contribute to the overall community of Canada. And we found also that we could maintain our own values, maintain our own beliefs, maintain our own communities, and still be a part of the greater country of Canada. And so I'm always very pleased to see more newcomers coming in who demonstrate the same values that my family brought to this country and that other families brought to this country. So whether you're an immigrant, new or old, whether you've been here for some generations, it doesn't matter. We bring the same values to contribute to a better Canada. And I'd like to thank the members of the Chinese Canadian Conservative Association for organizing this event, and for all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here with me. I look forward to meeting those of you I have not yet shaken hands with, but we want to discuss here how the Conservative Party can continue to reach out to the Chinese Canadian community here in Markham and across the country. And I know that members of this association have done great work in engaging in this sort of outreach community activity, and based on our shared values of free enterprise, low taxes, strong families, the Conservative Party truly is building a strong foundation within the Chinese Canadian community. And the foundation is growing within other cultural communities in Southern Ontario as well. We welcomed a new MP, Wajid Khan, the Member of Parliament for Mississauga-Streetsville, who I will be seeing tomorrow, and he brought with him a host of former Liberals who have grown disillusioned with that party. Mr. Khan's move to our party was not rooted in a cliched partisanship of the party system. I believe it came from a principled desire to enhance our country's voice and status on the international stage. Because I believe, as I believe many in the Chinese community shared the same value, that we not only come to make Canada strong, but then we have an international responsibility to ensure that we strengthen democratic values, democratic principles across this globe. Many of you, as immigrants to Canada, have a special perspective not only of Canada's international reputation, but on the way we work to welcome new Canadians. And the Conservative Party welcomes new Canadians with open arms. And unlike the Liberals, who have taken new Canadians and ethnocultural groups for granted for so long, we actually want to get things done for these newcomers to Canada. We've improved the temporary foreign worker program to make it easier for employers to hire foreign workers where there are no Canadian citizens or permanent residents available to fill the position. We've delivered new funding for settlement services. We've reduced the immigration right of landing fee in our first budget, exactly as we promised in our election campaign. And I think very significantly, we've righted a historical wrong when Prime Minister Stephen Harper formally apologized for the racist Chinese head tax on behalf of the Government of Canada. And we began paying symbolic redress to those affected. And we did this all in our first year in office. You are also respected business people. Many of you have come here to build a better life for your families in a country that rewards enterprise and hard work. While you can appreciate that government has a role to play in the economic prosperity of the country, you also know that businesses and families succeed best when taxes are lowered and when government knows when to get out of the way. Our Prime Minister understands this as well. He leads a Conservative Party in a government that makes free enterprise and low taxes a priority for all Canadians, old and new. As Treasury Board President, I have an important role in ensuring that this priority is reflected in the way that our government operates. In business and in government, we're all driven by a powerful motivational force, the idea that tomorrow can and will be better than today. And that's why I believe that for our country, the best is yet to come. In any case, 2006 was a momentous year for Canada. Canadians turned away from a culture of entitlement in government to something better for themselves and their children. And I want to talk to you very briefly about how Canada's government is making that happen. And today I want to talk about two themes specifically: accountability and fiscal responsibility. As President of the Treasury Board, I have the unique opportunity to be at the center of change in both of those areas. And I have a full plate of challenges ahead of me in my new role. But before I discuss these challenges, I would like to take you back a year ago, last January, when Canadians voted for change. Canadians elected our party on our commitments to provide real tax relief for Canadians, to help parents with the cost of raising their children, to crack down on crime, which is plaguing our communities, and perhaps importantly as well, to clean up government. And we have followed through with those commitments. On our tax relief, we acted as we promised. We reduced the GST by 1 percentage point. We also brought in a budget that provided over $20 billion in total tax relief to Canadians over the next 2 years. 4 times more, that's more than the last 4 Liberal budgets provided to Canadians. In his economic and fiscal update in November, Finance Minister Jim Flaherty introduced Advantage Canada. What is Advantage Canada? What does it mean for the ordinary Canadian? Well, we have looked at a number of issues in respect of Advantage Canada. It will give Canadians the advantages needed to compete in a global economy in the 21st century. Lowering taxes, increasing opportunities, creating more opportunities for education, for our youth, and importantly, providing infrastructure so that goods, services, and people can move in a seamless way from our cities and ports and other points in order to ensure that our communities grow and prosper. We have fulfilled our promise on child care. Earlier this year, we implemented the Universal Child Care Benefit, a plan that is already providing Canadian families with monthly payments of $100 each per child for children under age 6. We believe that the best child care for our children is families, and wherever possible, we want to ensure that mothers and fathers have the opportunity to stay at home with their children where they choose, and to help them with the costs of raising those children. And more than 1.9 million children and their families are benefiting from this initiative alone. As I've said, we have come through on tackling crime. As Justice Minister, I introduced almost a dozen bills making our streets and communities safer. Now, the task of getting those bills finally through to law, completed, will fall on the shoulders of Peter Van Loan as our House Leader to get those bills through. And I know that we will not simply end at the agenda that I brought forward in the House, and when Peter pushes those bills through the House to a successful completion, but we know that Rob Nicholson, the new Justice Minister, will continue with those same initiatives to keep our streets and our communities safe and strong. What I am so very disappointed about is the promises that Liberals made to the people of Canada during the election. They said that they were going to get tough on crime as well. They said enough of that house arrest and conditional sentences for repeat offenders. And yet, the first people to oppose the initiatives that we brought forward in terms of actually ensuring that repeat offenders no longer plague the community, the first to vote against them were the Liberals and your Liberal MP in this area. That is not acceptable. That's not what Canadians elected them to do, and yet they went back on their word. They promised Canadians, when the gun crimes were rising in this city especially, that they would get tough on gun crimes. And yet they are stalling our legislation in Parliament, they are stalling it in committee, and they are not following through on the commitments that they made in order to toughen up on guns and gangs and the drug trade that is associated with those guns and gangs. We've also seen the disappointment that they are opposed to our legislation, where we are aiming to send the most dangerous of offenders to prison so that they do not victimize our children, our families, our parents. And yet, the Liberals have said they will not support our dangerous offender legislation. Many people in the communities come up to me and say, you know, Vic, we like the legislation that you brought forward, but why would you give dangerous offenders a third time to offend before you actually send them away for life? Well, we've been very careful in the way we've drafted our legislation. We've taken into account all of the constitutional concerns, and there's nothing preventing a Crown Attorney from moving on a dangerous offender application after the first offense. But we thought that after an individual has been convicted 3 times of a violent offense, has been sent to a penitentiary, which means more than 2 years sentence on each time, and he's been sentenced there at least twice. Certainly, at the third time, a judge should be able to say, this individual has shown a callous disregard for the safety of people in Canada, and therefore that individual should be designated a dangerous offender. Common, ordinary Canadians agree with that. Why can't the Liberal Party of Canada understand that the people in our communities who come here to this country, who work hard, who pay taxes, who want safe communities, who want their families protected, why don't the Liberals understand that ordinary Canadians do not want dangerous offenders on their streets? Hear, hear. Yeah, yeah. So we will continue to move on with the help of Peter Van Loan, and it's a very difficult situation to be in for us as a minority government. We know where we want to go, and I think Canadians are beginning to understand exactly where we are going as a government, and that we as Conservatives are prepared to follow through on our agenda, that we will keep our word and carry out our promises. Now, we've also made accountability our #1 priority, and we have delivered. The Federal Accountability Act was passed due to the efforts of John Baird, the former Treasury Board Minister, and this is an act that will rebuild trust that Canadians should have in their politicians in Ottawa. This bill contains the most extensive anti-corruption measures ever implemented by a federal government. And now, as President of the Treasury Board, I will have the responsibility for implementing that particular act, the act that my predecessor, John Baird, brought forward. The Federal Accountability Act and the companion action plan protects whistleblowers. It will increase the rigor in government appointments, and it will improve government contracting. It will strengthen financial management. It will improve internal audit functions within departments and ensure more consistent discipline for those who deliberately break the rules. One of the things that needs to be mentioned over and over again, the problem with the sponsorship scandal, the problem with the prior Liberal government was not that there were no rules in place. There were many rules in place. The problem was that the government failed to follow the rules, that individuals broke the rules, as the Auditor General said. And so what we are looking for is not simply adding on more rules. If people don't obey the rules and aren't held accountable, more rules don't make any difference. But what we will do is, in fact, improve the accountability through the efforts of the Auditor General and the Ethics Commissioner. They will receive the power and the resources that they need in order to be effective, independent watchdogs over our government. And we have no fear that these individuals will be there watching our government operate, because we believe that that is what Canadians expect of us as a government. We have toughened the laws around the financing of political parties and candidates, which is actually good news for many of you, because we're no longer able to ask you for as much money as we were in the past. In the past, political contributions were up to $5,000 per individual, and we've lowered that to $1,000, and we've made it an offense to receive cash amounts of more than $20, because we believe big money shouldn't drive the political agenda, and that there is no room for untraceable envelopes of cash in Canadian politics. The Canadian government is one of the largest purchasers of goods and services in the country. So we've also taken steps to reform the way the government procurement system works, to ensure that the bidding process is fair, open, and transparent. And I've heard from many small vendors, small business people, many of you may fall into that category, where they seem to get placed out of the running for government work because they are small. And so what we've done is taken steps to ensure that small vendors in all regions of Canada get the consideration that they deserve when bidding for government business. And so we're providing more resources to the Office of Small and Medium Enterprises to address the concerns of smaller business. We know that small business, many of the businesses right here in this mall, are exactly the kind of businesses that drive the Canadian economy, and they should receive their fair share of work from the government and should be entitled to bid for that work in a fair, open, and transparent process. Government should be going out of its way to ensure that small businesses gets the same advantages that big businesses do. My department is responsible for keeping tabs on how your government spends your money. And the responsibility is something that I take very seriously. When I go home to my constituents in Provencher in Manitoba, I have to be able to look my constituents directly in the eye and be able to say to them that I have done everything in my power to ensure that their hard-earned money that they send to Ottawa has been spent wisely and on things that matter to them. One of the things that people may not realize, and this came as a bit of a surprise to me, but there are large amounts in our $224 billion budget on an annual basis where there is no effective review of how that money is spent. What do I mean by that? We have what they call an A-base budget. And that A-base budget is a way of talking about money that is rolled over from year to year to year. It's automatically approved every year. And no one actually examines the spending of that money to see whether that money is being spent effectively. There is no mechanism, a real mechanism in place to ensure that. And so when new government priorities are brought forward and the civil servants, the public servants ask for more money, no one goes back and says, well, what about the A-base $45 billion? They just add onto that A-base funding. And so in 6 years, that unreviewed money, that pocket of unreviewed money, has grown in 6 years under the Liberals from $45 billion to $90 billion. $90 billion, that is essentially rolled over year after year after year. Now, what does that mean? $45 billion means $1,500 for every family view of how that money is spent. What do I mean by that? We have what they call an A-base budget. And that A-base budget is a way of talking about money that is rolled over from year to year to year. It's automatically approved every year. And no one actually examines the spending of that money to see whether that money is being spent effectively. There is no mechanism, a real mechanism in place to ensure that. And so when new government priorities are brought forward and the civil servants, the public servants ask for more money, no one goes back and says, well, what about the A-base $45 billion? They just add onto that A-base funding. And so in 6 years, that unreviewed money, that pocket of unreviewed money, has grown in 6 years under the Liberals from $45 billion to $90 billion. $90 billion, that is essentially rolled over year after year after year. Now, what does that mean? $45 billion means $1,500 for every family of 4 in Canada. $1,500 out of your pocket, and no effective mechanism to review that, a period of time as possible. For example, in the most recent budget, we put aside $13 billion to address the debt. Very significant contribution, but of course, when you owe $500 billion, it's still a small contribution. But to those who say, well, that's money misspent, or we should have spent it on programming, remember what $13 billion does. $13 billion saves the taxpayers of Canada, by paying that towards debt, $650 million every year in perpetuity. So that is $650 million that suddenly becomes free to either spend on programming that we can afford, or in fact goes back to taxpayers in terms of lower taxes. So we are committed in an orderly fashion to eliminate that debt, and we will do so in as quickly a period of time as we can. Peter, in terms of the Advantage Canada, to eliminate the net debt, was that a generation essentially, or 15 years?
I thought it was 20 years.
20 years, all right. So I might be a little mixed up on what a generation is, but I think it's 20 years to eliminate the net debt, which means that we will have more in assets that the government of Canada has than liabilities. Now that isn't eliminating the entire debt, but that's certainly the way we're working on. It's much like the Alberta government did. That was its first step that it took to eliminating its debt. It eliminated its net debt when its assets in its heritage fund exceeded its liabilities, and then it worked on getting rid of the overall debt. I'm somewhat familiar with the issue. I haven't had a full briefing on that, nor has our cabinet had an opportunity to discuss that particular issue. All I can say is that the RBC has indicated that it operates in an international field, and that they feared repercussions from the American authorities if they continued with those accounts. Now, I can't say at this point what steps our government can take, if any. But certainly, it's an issue that's been brought to my attention, and that our cabinet will be discussing that.
Clearly, it's discriminatory. If a Canadian citizen is to open a certain bank account or engage in services of a Canadian bank, they are then allowed. The bank is then allowed to ask whether they hold dual citizenship, which is allowed in our country. How is that practice not discriminatory? I mean, I appreciate the RBC's position, and that's what's been reported in the press, but what is the government's position? And I appreciate that the cabinet hasn't talked about it.
And cabinet hasn't taken a formal position on that. Obviously, it's an issue that's of concern. We have many citizens who hold dual citizenship, and I'm just wondering whether the American approach is overbroad in terms of, if the issue is trying to root out terrorism, certainly there are better, more focused ways of doing that.
Well, I guess the issue is not how the Americans handle it, but how our banks actually respond to that, right? The Americans are free to make their own laws, but our banks are responding to that, is my question.
Well, and because, as the banks would say, I'm not here to apologize for the banks, but what the banks are saying is that we operate in an international market, and if we want to continue to operate, we have to follow that, given the influence of the Americans. Now, is that an appropriate policy? It seems to me that it's rather broad and impacts on legitimate individuals without really focusing on the key issue of terrorism.
I guess we should clarify who the RBC so far.
Well,
to our understanding.
That's all I can say at this time.
Our government has been achieving a number of things on the international front lately. One of the things which I think the Chinese community here, and particularly those who support the government, is very interested in, is the matter of outreach to the Far East. Now, more recently, of course, the Prime Minister has appointed a certain gentleman from the Mississauga area, who was recently a Liberal, but is now a very strong Conservative, to outreach in the subcontinent of Asia. I'm talking about India and the Middle East, and that's very far-reaching. However, we're wondering if there is, just on the horizon, a similar kind of program for, shall we say, the Pacific border of that particular same Asian continent. As you know, the Prime Minister made some inroads in APEC back in November. However, how are we following up on that in terms of exploratory and outreach?
I think that part of that will be determined after Mr. Emerson gets back. Minister Emerson gets back from China. He left, I believe it was today or yesterday, on his trip to China. And we feel that this is a very important step by our government. We want to ensure that we have good relationships with China. We have certain principles that we enter the international field in. I think our Prime Minister has been very clear about his concern about issues of human rights. But we also want to ensure that we can develop appropriate trade relationships with Pacific Rim countries, Asian countries, and I think that when Minister Emerson gets back from that China trip, we will have a briefing on that, and I think there may be more on that point. But this is a very important step, the trip by Minister Emerson that he has just undertaken yesterday.
I wonder if you could expand a little.
That's a good point. It's getting a little out of my area, and I don't want to commit the government on anything at this point. But I can say that advice that the Chinese community, for example, could give to our Prime Minister in that respect, I think would be very helpful, given the large numbers of Chinese that we have in Canada now. Not just first generation, but people who've been here as long as my people have been here.
Well, that's our point.
I think it's more a realization that we haven't done enough to reach out to the Chinese community. That even though we, and not just the Chinese community, but other communities, even though we fundamentally share the same values as the Chinese community, still, the Chinese community has not been overly supportive of the Conservative Party. And yet we believe that when our platform is actually explained in terms of our values, whether it's fiscal values, social values, or other values, we are in much closer agreement with most new Canadians than any other party. So I was very pleased to see the Prime Minister appoint my colleague Jason Kenney as the new Secretary of State, dealing with particularly those issues. I think it shows that we're very serious about it, and we need to focus on ensuring that people understand our message. Ultimately, the decision of how they're going to vote will be a decision they make, but we want to ensure that they understand our message and that we share their values.
So it's for the election, you mean? Prepare
Well,
for the election coming up.
You know, that's a crude way of saying it. I would say that we as a party need more newcomers within our party to strengthen our party, to continuously make it more relevant. And I think what you will see with our party is that we don't need newcomers simply for an election. We need their ongoing support to build a stronger country. I think the principled approach that the Prime Minister has taken, for example, in the Middle East, is not something that is necessarily justified by the polls. It's something that he believes as a matter of principle, that our party believes as a matter of principle. And we think that by advancing our principles in a public way, people will understand, will support us, yes, during election time as well, but generally to keep conservative governments in power in order to advance values that are consistent, especially fiscal and economic values.
Just one follow-up, because I talked to Jason Kenney earlier last week.
Yes.
I just want to make clear, I don't know whether the Conservative government actually is now wanting more support from the Chinese community. One is the voters' role. They vote for the Conservative government. on the other hand, more Chinese people join the Conservative Party? Is it to actually you're recruiting your voters and the people join the Conservative Party?
Well, are we making inroads to the Chinese community, if that's what you're asking, either through the party or through government? I believe we are. I believe our message is resonating. People are understanding that, as I say, our values are values that they share in common with us. And so if we believe the same things, if we want the same things for our families and for our country and for our businesses, why shouldn't we be out there communicating it? And it's not enough to say that, we'll wait until the Liberals are so corrupt that they'll just collapse as a government. We need to be more proactive in actually telling Canadians what we stand for. And that has been the focus that our Prime Minister has been having us adopt in terms of getting us out into these areas where we presently don't have an MP. I mean, we have MPs who border on here, but we don't have this riding. And so we say, well, why is it that people here who share our values don't vote for us? So either our message isn't right, and I believe our message is right, or we're not doing a good enough job in communicating. So we're out there communicating more. And once people become familiar with us, I think they'll support us in greater numbers. I'm convinced of it. For example, I just draw this to your attention. In my riding, I come from a riding, Western Canada, rural. 18% of the population there is French Canadian, Franco-Manitoba. Their traditional base has always been the Liberal Party. And I made a specific effort of going out into the Francophone communities, even though I don't speak French. I made a specific effort of going out there and saying, I'm going to be the MP, but I want your support when I go to Ottawa. This last election, I won every single Francophone poll other than one, because that keeps you humble. It means you got to go out there and still got to work on that one poll. And that's, I believe, in the same way that, can we form government without communities like this? Maybe we can. We did. But I would like to form government with a riding like this and actually have a representative from your community as the MP from this area.
Joseph Lau from Toronto TV. I've seen many MPs going to the Markham by-election party, and also more conservative MP from other provinces other than Ontario come to Ontario. It's giving me an impression that the provincial conservative is running a campaign, and also the federal conservative is running a campaign. So what kind of time frame that we're expecting the next federal election?
I don't know when the next federal election is going to be, and I think it's going to depend more on the other parties than it is going to be on our party. The one thing that Prime Minister Harper has said, I want to govern over this next year in order to put our priorities and our agenda in place. And so we are not looking at an immediate election. What we are saying is we're ready for an election. We have more money, we are more organized, and we are more committed than any other party. But we're not focusing on an election. We are focusing on government and ensuring that the policies that we ran on are actually implemented by our government. That's our focus. And I think people will see that.
It won't be too long, but I'm pleased to be here as York Region's voice in Canada's cabinet. I might say the only Conservative elected here in York Region, and obviously I have a great interest in ridings like this one that we're in right now, which is Markham, Richmond Hill, Markham Oak Ridges, and the rest in York Region, because these are ridings that historically have been Conservative, and I believe can be Conservative again, and will be, because we're putting forward as a government exactly the kinds of priorities that people in these communities have as their priorities. In the year ahead, you will see us focusing, and I should just say, as government House Leader. I was president of the Queen's Privy Council in my previous cabinet role.
Too many presidents.
Too many presidents in the room. As government House Leader, it's my job to steer that agenda of government legislation through Parliament. And that means I do get to choose what our priorities are, but to some extent our priorities are known and are clear to everybody. We want to cut taxes and control spending so that we're helping ordinary, hard-working Canadians. We want to improve the environment and the health of all Canadians, and you'll see us moving on that front. We're going to continue to show the kind of leadership we've been showing on the world stage, the kind of leadership Canada hasn't shown in over a decade on the world stage. And we're going to continue working to get tough on crime. I do want to focus on that in particular for a minute, because Vic was our Justice Minister, brought forward a tremendous package of reforms that people have been calling for, people in this community. We have had very serious problems with gun crime and gang crime, particularly in Markham and York region and Toronto to the south. And we have brought forward a number of very strong proposals, some of which have made progress, but some of which are encountering real resistance from a Liberal opposition that just does not accept or understand the concerns and the fears of residents of communities like Markham. I take, for example, Bill C-10, which was our proposal for mandatory penalties for those who commit crimes with guns, serious crimes, those who are in possession of illegal guns. And this bill would require that those people, when convicted of committing a violent crime with a gun, would have to go to jail. They wouldn't be released, they couldn't be released by a judge into the community without doing jail time. Well, that's a bill that we campaigned on. It's a bill that we thought the Liberal Party campaigned on. But in this region, members of Parliament like John McCallum and Brian Wilford, members of Parliament who say they're tough on crime, voted against that bill, as they did vote against other pieces of legislation that we put forward to get tough on crime. And so if people are concerned about getting tough on crime in this community, we have a real choice, a clear choice, between a Liberal Party that says one thing, and then when the time comes to vote and show their real cards on the table, does something entirely different, and a Conservative Party that tells you what it's going to do, is committed to get tough on crime, and is delivering on those things. So that's an important part of an agenda, and I'll continue to work on trying to get that through the House in the fall. And of course, the final of our 5 priorities for the coming year is my own responsibility as Minister for Democratic Reform. And we are going to focus on democratic reform, making our democracy work better for all Canadians, and that includes trying to reform the Senate, an unaccountable, unelected Senate where members sit, senators for as many as 45-year terms. We want to see that reduced to 8 years, and we want to allow for some kind of democracy. This is supposed to be one of the world's great democracies. We're not sure that it's appropriate to not have some form of consultation with Canadians on who they want representing them in the Senate. And we also want to focus on cleaning up our elections some more. I just want to say a little bit about our role with the cultural communities. And I have a long history of 31 years in the party as a president of the Ontario PC Party, as a president of the PC Party of Canada. I was president of the Ontario Party when we got David Tabucci elected to represent this riding. A very good friend of mine who left a tremendous legacy behind. I'm very much looking forward to seeing Alex Yuan elected in this riding in the upcoming by-election so that he can improve on that legacy. And the reason I say that's particularly important because when we talk about the Chinese community, I know I spent years trying to reach out to communities and bring in candidates. The Chinese community is one that, through their own choice, has put forward fewer candidates in elections than most other multicultural communities in Canada. And I can understand, I come from a background as an Estonian where my family experienced the horrors of living under communist tyranny. Much of my family died in Siberian camps in the Gulag or otherwise at the hands of the communists. And I understood that reluctance among my mother and my grandparents to get involved in politics. I was lucky. I grew up knowing how important our democracy was and how precious our freedom was, without that same fear, because I hadn't lived the experiences they had where taking a tough stand could be a matter of life and death, could affect their careers, could affect their futures. And I'm looking forward and hoping that we will see more and more people from the Chinese community stepping forward in all parties to become candidates, to become members of Parliament, to take a mainstream role in life, because the Chinese community has become such an important force in the cultural life of Canada, in the economic life of Canada. It's time that the Chinese community stepped forward and took its role as leaders in the political life of Canada, which they have every right to be and they should be. And that has been the role of that has been the focus of our party, to provide that opportunity for people to step forward in the mainstream, not in separate ghettos like you see in the Liberal Party where they play lip service to the cultural communities, But when the time comes, they use their power of appointment to ensure that people who they like get the nominations in the party brass, rather than allowing a democratic process to unfold. We don't allow that in our party. We have a genuine democratic process where there is a nomination in every riding, and the people, the members of the party, get to decide. And we think that's the best way to see that advance and that progress in the mainstream. And it's a proud tradition in our party. The fact of Canadian history is that the Conservative Party has always been the party of new Canadians, the party of reaching out, the party of building Canada. From Sir John A. Macdonald, who brought together French and English, Old Canadian and New Canadian, East and West, to build a vision of a country that could never existed before and that could be one of the great countries of the world, and that's what it's come to become because of that vision of Sir John A. Macdonald bringing people together. And subsequently, leaders like John Diefenbaker, the first non-English, non-French speaking, non-French origin Prime Minister of Canada. When my mother came to this country, and she came shortly after World War II, and then she was going to the University of Toronto, one of the first people she met at university was a woman named Vic Toews. And she was a Latvian immigrant. My mother was an Estonian immigrant. And my mother encouraged her to get involved in politics, and she said to my mother, well, you know, that's ridiculous. Here in Canada, you can't get elected, you can't get anywhere in politics unless you're English or if you're French. Otherwise, people like us who are new Canadians, we don't have a place. Well, a few years later, John Diefenbaker became Prime Minister of Canada. Not English, not French, from a different background altogether. And then he brought in the Bill of Rights, a great step forward, once eliminating discrimination in Canada, or making that effort to put in law for the first time the kind of equality as between races, religions, cultures. And that is the legacy of the Conservative Party, and it's always been there. The reason I talk about Vic Toews because after that, she did become interested in politics, and when her homeland of Estonia finally gained freedom, she went back there. And today she's the president of Latvia. On her homeland, Latvia, I think I said Estonia. Estonia is where my mother came from. Two countries beside each other, both suffering that same Soviet history. So there is, in this history of Canadians, those of us who are new Canadians or come from that heritage, this notion that we can come into this country, that we can have a real place in the mainstream, that we can build a brighter life and future for ourselves. But that doesn't mean just doing well economically or doing well with a great education. It means also having a real stake in our political future. And then projecting those Canadian values of freedom, hope, opportunity, respect for the rule of law all across the world. And we saw that again when Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister of this country, and he took a bold stand on apartheid in South Africa. A bold stand that stood him separate from some of our closest allies at the time. But it was a principled stand. It was the right thing to do. It may have cost us a little bit in our relations with Great Britain and the United States at the time, but it was a stand that said, guess what? When it comes to fundamental questions of race, of equality, there is no compromise. There can be no fuzziness. Equality is an absolute, and it's a question of respect and dignity of humanity. And that is, again, the Conservative tradition. That commitment to freedom, that commitment to human rights, that commitment to the rule of law around the world, not just here at home, but around the world, and not being willing to turn a blind eye when we see oppression, but actually standing up for those freedoms. And that's why the Conservative Party, I think, is the party of all new Canadians. That's why I became involved in the Conservative Party, having grown up hearing those stories in an immigrant family. And that's why I know that we see a real opportunity in the future to grow within the cultural community. So I'm excited about what the future has to offer. Vic Toews always is fond of saying that you've got to be an optimist about what the future has. And I've obviously been very fortunate coming from one of those immigrant backgrounds like Vic himself. We've both done reasonably well, but we think there's so many more who can do the same kind of thing, and I'm looking very much to seeing more Chinese Canadians stepping forward and taking on those roles of leadership in Canadian society in the future. So thank you very much.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Minister Toews and Minister Randon for the busy time to come over to Markham, my riding, Markham Union. Well, I think the message is very loud and clear. For most of you in the past, it's very difficult for us to run in public life under the Conservative banner. With the new approach of the Conservative Party, as the media have mentioned, all of a sudden you can see all and witness all the ministers coming to try to show inclusiveness to the community, not only Chinese, but across all community in Ontario. Believe me or not, I think time is coming sooner or later very soon in Ontario, we will elect the first Conservative MP from the Chinese community because of your visit. Okay, and I think without any further discussion, I just want to call Mr. Victor to come. Say thank you for the time for coming over here. Again, pleasure.